you. Thank you for being this year as well together in the annual conference. It is a privilege for me to continue and present a wider work on the Syriac Gospels. The previous year I presented on Matthew. We will repeat some points, some major points from Matthew, but the main point is to compare the use of the tetragrammaton as appears in the Syriac versions between Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and Mark. Let's see what I mean in the following. Of course, as already has been said, that the Syriac versions are important witnesses for establishing the text of the Greek New Testament, establishing the text and also understanding the text, mainly when we speak about translators. The ancient Syriac New Testament versions can provide minute glimpses of a West Aramaic gospel tradition, and this is very important because it has to do with the centuries that are starting from the end of the first century to the second century and the third century and on. It is an important period for the history of the development of the Gospels. Justin has already underscored that a thin undercurrent surfacing sporadically in the Old Syriac and Peshitta Gospels of primitive Aramaic readings and expressions, which are not dependent on a Greek text form. And these are important for keeping in mind that we want to discover the Semitic mentality between the Gospels. And this affects, of course, the critical textual critical choices and also the translation teams that work on the text of the New Testament. This undercurrent of Aramaic reading seems to derive from a West Aramaic gospel tradition, oral or written, which was known to the Christian community in Mesopotamia before it was reached by translations of the Greek Gospels. And this is obvious in the history, in the development of the Syriac Gospels. Consequently, he explains, the same author, splinters of a West Aramaic gospel tradition were preserved in the Old Syriac and Peshitta versions. Then this may allow us, at least in some cases, to go back beyond the Greek gospel text to a more original Aramaic text form. Of course, a large-scale Aramaic retroversion of the New Testament has no chance of reconstructing the original Aramaic of the Gospels, as Cook already has said, and it's true. Such a radical retroversion cannot be made, cannot be achieved with the tools we have in our hands today. But within the Syriac Peshitta, it's discernible, as I have already written, the distinction between Kyrios, rendered as Maria, and we will discuss it further later, and refers to God the Father as signified by the Tetragrammaton, and other forms like Maran, Marie, and so on, that do not have anything to do, does not relate it with the Tetragrammaton. So, here I mention some reference bibliography that I take some points from there. It's Crossley, Casey, Telford, that find and support an Aramaic, this Aramaic level, stage rather, of the text, and it's important to understand it better, the role in the final composition of the Greek text and also the history of other New Testament translations. Here is an overview of the available Syriac translations, as already many of us know well. We have the Old Testament prepared during the 1st century and the early 2nd century CE, the Old Testament text in Syriac from Hebrew translated. Then we have the Diatessaron after mid-2nd century. We have the Old Syriac from the late 2nd century to the 4th century. It was not a stable text, as we can see from the 2 copies that we have, the Cureton Codex and the Sinaitic Palimpsest. And circa 400 CE, we have the New Testament Peshitta that is considered a revision of the Old Syriac. Then we have the Philoxenian that is not survived anymore, and the Heraclean recension, that all these are the development of the Syriac text. Here are some images. I have to say here that the second one, the Curetonian one, does not survive the Mark's text, but only the epilogue of the Mark's Gospel, but not the main text of Mark's Gospel. So we'll use the rest of the Syriac versions. I will not press on the theories on the connection, the relation between Diatessaron and the Old Syriac. Some more important things are below. Here is the Kyras text that it's very important, this work that have been done by George Anton Kyras, that has put all the available Syriac translations interlinearly, so we can compare what's going on in these Syriac translations that has centuries difference between them. And here we see the verse of Mark 12th chapter 36 verse. Here is an early theochristology. We have already discussed it the previous year at the same section the year before. The different, we know the theologies and the Christologies in the early centuries, and this is depicted in the development of the Syriac New Testament text. We will not say more on this. It's important to remember how at that early Christianity era, the era that Christian congregations make their voice heard and be differentiated by the Jewish co-religionists until some time in the end of the 1st century and the early 2nd century. At the early centuries CE, we see that in Hebrew, the Tetragrammaton is translated in Aramaic script, in Paleo-Hebrew scripts by 4 dots, in Aramaic script glossed by Adonai, and other minor representations. In Greek, we have either the use of Aramaic script of the Hebrew Tetragrammaton, in Paleo-Hebrew, and renderings like EAO of the Tetragrammaton in Greek. Of course, we have the surrogate Kyrios that is later used and takes the control in the end in all the available New Testament manuscripts. But this comparison is based on the Old Testament manuscripts we have available from that early Christian centuries. In Aramaic, we see that it is used, the Tetragrammaton, in the first 2 letters, the first 3 letters, or the Yod, He form. There is a tendency for avoiding the Tetragrammaton in Aramaic literature. In Syriac, we see that the Tetragrammaton is differentiated, it becomes clear in the text by the use of the term Maria that is used only for rendering the Tetragrammaton. But in imitation to Hebrew translation practices, as found in Greek scriptures, we see also the use of the Yod, He, or the PP, as was read from the Greek. So we have a deformed Tetragrammaton this way, and also the Alaha that represents the God in Aramaic. Here are 2 manuscripts, 2 hexaplaric manuscripts that these 2 forms appear, the Maria form SPP and the Yod-He representing the tetragrammaton in the margin. And this practice of separating the Maria for the tetragrammaton is also found in the New Testament, and this is the core of my current research. In the Greek New Testament copies, we have the nomina sacra, the use of kappa and sigma for kyrios. In the late Hebrew New Testament translations that we have from the 10th century and on, we have either the tetragrammaton with the 4 letters or other forms using 2, 3, or different forms of yods. Now, for the things that will follow, we see here the nomina sacra that that were transferring some information, and we will discuss it below. Here we see verses Matthew 22:44 and Mark 12:36, the same verse as a reference from Psalm 110, verse 1, that we see that Maria speaks to Marie, to my Lord. And this is differentiated in the earliest translations available, but it's not made the same in the last one we have available, the Harklian of the 7th century. Here, both for God and the Father and Jesus is used the term Maria. So we lose that textual apparatus for differentiating between the Father and the Son. So something that was already lost in the Greek manuscripts, in the Greek development of the text, in the 7th century appears as well in the Syriac text. Here, I would say just an example of a French New Testament translation of the Mark that keeps this differentiation in the New Testament, using a term to render the tetragrammaton and a different term for the Lord, my Lord, prophetically about Jesus. We must say that early fathers like Eusebius, they knew the difference. They had access to the manuscripts, and they knew that it was a different kyrios when we were speaking about the Father. In the Hebrew text, it was the tetragrammaton, and it was a different kyrios when we were talking about Jesus. And here Eusebius says, don't even think that the second my Lord in the verse we already discussed is about the God of all things. No, it's about my God and my King, that is Jesus. Here we would make a tiny reference to nomina sacra transferring semantic information. So we see that the scribe A of Codex Sinaiticus did not distinguish between sacral and non-sacral use of the nomina sacra. But the scribe B, the second scribe, makes a distinction, as we see in his re-inking, in his writing. The scribes of Vaticanus and Alexandrinus codices are making more arbitrary use of the nomina sacra. So we see that some scribes attempt to make a differentiation between the full kyrios and the nomina sacra kyrios. But this was not kept to the majority of the manuscripts, of course. So we see that, for example, Tertullian in the early 3rd century was reading manuscripts that there were no variation between the lords. So he said that I find in scripture the name Lord also applied to them both. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit on my right hand. So for him there was no textual differentiation, because already in the Greek text there was no, the New Testament copies had no variation between the lords. However, the Syriac branch of New Testament copies kept until, as we already said, almost the 7th century, this differentiation. Okay. Okay, about the dating, I wouldn't say more on this, but as I would like to include the comment by Cassie that says that parts of Mark's gospel are literal translations of written Aramaic sources. And in his excellent book, he discusses this important feature for the important Gospel of Mark, and he proves these Aramaic sources that are found under the Greek text. This is true, as already Booth has written for the Synoptic Gospels, both for all the three of them. Okay, the layers that we have for the text, the distinction that is distinguishable in the Syriac Pesita between Maria, Mara, and so on that we have already mentioned. Let's come now to the cases that in the Gospel of Mark is rendering Kyrios in Syriac. So here we see that in these verses, in these three first instances, in the first one, first chapter and 3 verse about the way of the Lord, we see that this is Delit's translations, of course, late translation, but the available text we have in the Syriac tradition, both the surviving ones, they have both the Maria. So we can, here in the Syriac tradition, from the earliest to the latest one, we have a homogeneous rendering of the Greek Kyrios, if there was a tradition, as we believe that there was, with Maria. In the rest of these verses, no tetragrammaton is meant. As we already said, in the Hartlean version is used the Maria form, but it is indistinguishable, does not carries any semantic information for differentiating between the Father and the Son, that for the previous centuries, the Syriac translations were doing so. In other verses, there is a consensus that this is here, for example, in the 5th chapter, 19th verse, the tetragrammaton, also in the name of the Lord here in the 11th chapter, differentiation for the forms that has of the mar, of the Syriac mar regarding the owner or the ser term that is used for referring to Jesus. And these two cases in the epilogue of the gospel that also some of them seem to mean the Father, but in 1619, the two older wants to mean the Son, when is meant in the Greek is used the term Kyrios. Here are the details, the conclusions here, that is the important part of this presentation. We see here regarding Mark, who is using the Maria term, and here is the Matthew that the previous year we had discussed here in this section of the conference. We see here that in Mark, in the narrative, we have a quotation from Prophet Isaiah. So in the narrative, Mark uses only once the Maria term, while Matthew used it not only in quotations, but in free speech, in his narration of the gospel. Regarding Jesus, in Mark, we see that he uses the Maria term, that is the tetragrammaton, speaking to a healed demon-possessed. When he speaks to a crowd, he uses the Tetragrammaton when as quotations of from the Hebrew scriptures. Sorry. And when Jesus speaks to his disciples, also in first person, we see the use of Maria. This is not the same, the case is not the same in Matthew, where we don't have Jesus speaking or using the Maria term or the Tetragrammaton in first person, speaking in first person. But as I mentioned in the conclusion here, that in Mark, in Jesus' mouth, the term Maria appears in quotation from the Hebrew scriptures, as is true for Matthew as well, when speaking to crowds. But in first person, when speaking more privately to a healed demon-possessed and also to his disciples. Here I make a reference to Luther's New Testament that follows the same way of textual apparatus. Luther also used the capital letters or half capitalized Herr, the Lord in German, to show where in the text he believes that the reference is to the Tetragrammaton. So we see that this same mentality of textual apparatus appeared in modern translations, as in Luther's, for example, or many others that followed Luther's. Okay, this was the most important conclusion compared to the ones that the previous years we mentioned, this differentiation. So I'd like to keep in mind, it's an important conclusion from all others that we would like to focus on, that in Jesus' mouth, in first person, in free speech, that means without quotating from the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus appears to use the term Maria, or the translators of the earliest Syriac versions, they put in Jesus' mouth the term Maria. So we have authors that try to reconstruct the Tetragrammaton in the Gospel of Mark, as already discussed on the Gospel of Matthew. So about Bartz, Berlinger, and Darby, Kilpatrick, Wilson, we would agree that with Bullinger and Darby that almost 10 times, 9 and 1 more that is found only in a Syriac textual tradition, but not in Greek. That's the reason that I don't say 10, but I say 9 and 1. We see in the Syriac translation one more time that is used for making clear a point in a verse. Almost 10 times that is used, surely used the Tetragrammaton, as is the use of the Maria term allow us to conclude. Of great importance, of course, for this work is Kira's work, both the comparative edition of the Syriac Gospels and, of course, his translation, in this case, of the book of Mark. Some bibliography, I will put this presentation in the internet, and whoever wants to add or to discuss more on these issues, your comments are more than welcome here today or in the future. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you, Pablo.